Mara Whitfield had always believed that kindness should never wait for the right moment. It was a small belief, but it had shaped her whole life. She worked as a veterinary assistant in Hollow Pine, a quiet mountain town where the winters were long and the people kept mostly to themselves. Every evening after her shift ended, she walked along the river that bordered the old Blackwood forest. The locals rarely went near that forest. They said it belonged to something older than the town itself, something that watched but never showed its face. Mara never paid much attention to those stories. She liked the quiet, she liked the sound of the water moving over the stones, and the way the trees seemed to hold their breath as the sun went down. On that particular evening, the air was colder than usual, and the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple. Mara pulled her jacket tighter and kept walking, her boots crunching softly against the frost-covered grass. She almost didn't see him. If it hadn't been for a low, ragged sound, half breath and half whimper, she might have walked straight past the fallen shape at the water's edge. It was a wolf. A massive one, larger than any she had ever seen in pictures or textbooks, his gray fur matted with blood near his front leg. His sides rose and fell in shallow, uneven movements, and his eyes, when they opened for a brief moment, held an unsettling brightness, like liquid gold catching the last of the sunlight. Most people would have run. Every instinct told Mara to back away slowly and call someone, anyone, who knew how to handle a wild animal in pain. But she didn't move. She crouched instead, keeping her voice low and steady, the same voice she used on frightened dogs and cats at the clinic when their owners weren't looking. "Hey there," she whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you. Just let me see." The wolf's eyes tracked her, sharp and aware, in a way that made the hair on her arms rise. But he didn't growl. He didn't snap. He simply watched her, as if deciding something far more complicated than whether or not to trust a stranger. Mara had brought her small emergency kit with her that day, more out of habit than anything else, since she often treated injured animals on her walks. She worked quickly and carefully, cleaning the wound at his leg, which looked like it had come from a trap, its edges cruel and precise, in a way that no ordinary hunting snare should have been. She wrapped it as best she could, murmuring reassurances the entire time, unaware that the wolf's golden eyes never once left her face. She stayed with him long after the sky had turned fully dark, refusing to leave a dying animal alone by the water. It was well past midnight when his breathing finally evened out, when the tension in his massive frame began to ease. Only then did she rise, her knees stiff from the cold ground, and make a quiet promise before she left. "I'll come back tomorrow. Just hold on." She never noticed the way his gaze followed her all the way until she disappeared past the tree line. What Mara did not know, could not have known, was that the wolf she had knelt beside was not simply a wolf. He was Cale Ashgrave, Alpha King of the Blackwood Pack, a leader whose bloodline had protected that stretch of forest for generations beyond counting. He had been patrolling the northern border alone, a habit his council disapproved of, but one he refused to give up, when he had walked directly into a trap laced with something that burned through his blood like fire. It was not an ordinary snare. It had been built specifically to catch something like him, something with power hidden beneath fur and bone. An alpha caught weak was an alpha who could be challenged. It was a truth as old as his pack itself, and it was the reason Cale had told no one, not even his most trusted council members, about the ambush. He had dragged himself to the river, hoping the cold water might slow the poison enough to let him think, to let him plan. Instead, he had simply collapsed, certain that this quiet stretch of water would be the last thing he ever saw. Then a human girl had knelt beside him. By every law of his bloodline, human hands were not supposed to touch him and survive. Wolves born into his line carried an old ward in their blood, one that scorched anyone outside the pack the moment their skin made contact, a defense against exactly the kind of vulnerability he now found himself in. He had braced for the burn even as her fingers pressed gently against his wounded leg. It never came. Her touch was warm, careful, ordinary in every way a human touch should be, and it left no mark of pain on him at all. That single, impossible detail unraveled everything Cale thought he understood about his own existence. He had lain there, weak and half-conscious, turning the mystery over and over in his mind, long after she had gone, the pain in his leg suddenly far less important than the question burning through his thoughts. Why hadn't the ward reacted? What was she? By the time dawn broke, Cale had shifted back to his human form, hidden deep within the tree line, watching the empty spot where she had knelt the night before. He told himself he was simply cautious, that any anomaly involving his own protective magic deserved careful observation. But some quieter, more honest part of him knew that wasn't the whole truth. Tamara returned the next evening exactly as she had promised, carrying a small bag of supplies in case the wolf was still there. She searched along the riverbank for nearly an hour, calling out softly, feeling a strange twist of worry in her chest when she found no sign of him. She told herself he had probably wandered off to heal in some den deeper in the woods, the way wild animals often did. Still, she couldn't shake the odd, hollow feeling of having lost something before she'd even had the chance to keep it. She didn't know that Cale was watching her from the shadows the entire time, his human form obscured by the deepening dusk, studying every line of worry on her face, and feeling something twist uncomfortably in his own chest in response. Over the following days, a new stranger began appearing around Hollow Pine. He called himself Cale, tall and broad-shouldered, with an unusually composed way of carrying himself, as though nothing in the world could catch him off guard. He appeared at the general store while Mara was buying supplies. He appeared at the small diner on Main Street while she ate her lunch. He never explained why he seemed to know the layout of the town so well for someone who claimed to be passing through, and Mara, distracted by her lingering worry over the missing wolf, never thought to ask. There was something about him that put her at ease despite the questions his presence raised. He listened when she spoke, really listened, in a way most people in her life didn't bother to anymore. When she mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she'd found an injured wolf by the river and had been worried about him ever since, something flickered behind Cale's eyes, something that looked almost like guilt mixed with disbelief, that she still thought of him at all. "I'm sure he's grateful," Cale said quietly. "Wherever he is. I just hope he's okay," Mara replied, unaware of how close the truth sat beside her. As the weeks passed, their conversations grew longer, easier, filled with the kind of comfortable silences that only formed between people who trusted each other without quite knowing why. Mara found herself looking forward to seeing him, to hearing his low, steady voice, though she couldn't explain the strange, persistent feeling that she had known him far longer than the few weeks since they'd met. Cale struggled with a battle far more complicated than any hunt he'd faced as Alpha. Duty demanded he report the anomaly of her untouched skin to his council, to have it examined, understood, controlled. But every instinct beneath that duty screamed at him to protect her instead, to keep her far from the politics and dangers of his world for as long as he possibly could. That protection became urgent far sooner than he hoped. The trap that had caught Cale had not been a random accident. It had been set and funded by a rival pack from the Eastern Ridge, one that had long resented Blackwood's claim over the richest hunting grounds in the region. When their hired hunters realized their target had somehow survived a wound meant to be fatal, they began searching for answers, and their search led them straight to the rumor of a local woman who treated injured animals with unusual skill. They didn't know she had healed an Alpha. They only knew that whoever had treated the wolf might hold the answer to why their trap had failed, and that answer was worth pursuing at any cost. Strange men began asking questions around Hollow Pine, at the general store, at the clinic where Mara worked, careful and vague in their inquiries, but persistent enough that people began to notice. Mara noticed too, though she couldn't understand why anyone would be so interested in an injured wolf she'd helped weeks ago. She mentioned it to Cale one evening, trying to laugh off the unease twisting in her stomach, and watched his expression turn suddenly, unmistakably serious. "Stay away from the river until I tell you it's safe," he said, his voice low and urgent in a way she'd never heard from him before. "Cale, you're scaring me." "I know," he admitted quietly. "I'm sorry. Please, just trust me." She did trust him, more than she could easily explain, but worry pulled her back toward the riverbank 2 evenings later anyway, some instinct telling her that whatever danger was circling, it was somehow tied to the wolf she still hadn't stopped thinking about. She told herself she only wanted to check the area one more time, to be sure there was nothing to fear. She was wrong. 2 men emerged from the tree line as she reached the water's edge, their expressions cold and calculating in a way that turned her worry into real fear. They asked her questions she couldn't answer, about a wolf, about whatever had made it survive their trap, their voices growing sharper and more threatening when her confusion only frustrated them further. Mara backed toward the water, her heart hammering, searching desperately for an escape that didn't seem to exist. That was when Cale arrived, moving faster than should have been humanly possible, placing himself firmly between Mara and the two hunters. What happened next unfolded almost too quickly for her frightened mind to fully process. His human form seemed to blur, to shift, until the massive gray wolf she remembered from that first night stood in his place, powerful and unmistakably furious, eyes blazing that same impossible gold. The hunters, faced with the very target of their search now very much alive and very much protecting the woman they'd been sent to question, didn't stay to fight. They fled into the trees, and Cale let them go, his priority in that moment entirely focused on making sure Mara was safe. He shifted back once the danger passed, breathing hard, watching her carefully for the shock and fear he expected to see on her face. Instead, Mara simply stared at him, pieces falling into place with a clarity that stole the breath from her lungs. "You're him," she whispered. "You're the wolf from the river." "Yes," Cale said quietly. There was no point in denying it any longer, not after what she'd just witnessed. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." He told her everything then, sitting beside her on the cold riverbank, exactly where their story had begun. He explained who he truly was, the weight of leading his pack, the protective ward that should have burned her the moment she touched him, and the ancient legend, thought lost for generations, of a bond between wolf and human so rare that most in his world no longer believed it existed at all. A true mate bond, unbroken by the magic meant to keep his kind separate from the world of ordinary people. Mara listened to all of it, stunned but strangely unshaken, the pieces of the past weeks finally making sense in a way that felt less like fear and more like understanding. She thought of every quiet conversation, every unexplained comfort she'd felt in his presence, and realized that some part of her had known, without knowing, exactly what she'd found that night by the river. "I saved you," she said softly, "and I didn't even know it." "You saved more than you realize," Cale answered. "You saved a king who forgot, just for one night, that he was supposed to be untouchable. And in doing that, you may have saved something my pack thought we'd lost forever." In the days that followed, Cale brought the truth of what happened to his council, using Mara's unwitting kindness as undeniable proof that the old bond magic still lived within their bloodline. Far from weakening his position, as their leaders had once feared such vulnerability would, it strengthened it, becoming proof of an ancient legacy few believed still existed. The rival pack's plot was exposed and dealt with, their hired hunters no longer a threat to Mara or anyone else in Hollow Pine. Mara chose to stay, even after learning the full truth of the world she'd stumbled into. There was no version of her old, ordinary life that felt real anymore, not after everything she now understood, and she found she didn't want it back anyway. She wanted this instead, whatever uncertain, extraordinary future stood in front of her. They returned to the riverbank often after that, the place where an ordinary evening walk had quietly rewritten both their lives. It was there, beneath the same darkening sky where she had once knelt beside a dying wolf, that Cale finally told her what he'd been carrying since that very first night. "The wolf you saved owes you a debt no king could ever fully repay," he said, his voice quiet and certain. "But I intend to spend the rest of my life trying anyway." Mara smiled, reaching for his hand, the same way she had reached for him that first night, without hesitation, without fear. The river moved on beside them, steady and unchanged, the quiet witness to a story that had begun with one small act of kindness and grown into something neither of them could have imagined.